My daughter-in-law locked me in the basement for my 3.8 m until I found the key. And something her feared. I can still feel the damp concrete pressing against my back, the smell of mold in every breath, and the faint hum of the washing machine above me as if mocking my silence. They all believed I was safe in my own home. But the truth is, I was locked in the basement by the woman who calls me her mother-in-law, just for the fortune I had worked my whole life to build. No one knew that somewhere beneath those cold steps there was a key hidden away, and something far darker than greed waiting to be uncovered. I thought I was done for, until that night when I decided that if no one was coming, I would be the one to walk myself out. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in your life is not the one who knocks on your door, but the one who already has a key to it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Subscribe if you believe it is never too late to stand up for yourself. I used to think the quiet in my house meant peace. After my husband passed, the room settled into a hush that was almost polite. The cedar steps creaked in familiar places. The furnace clicked on before sunrise, and from the kitchen window I could see the pine tops bending when the wind rolled down from the high desert. Bend is slower than Portland ever was, a place where the grocery clerk still remembers what you like to cook, and the pharmacist tells you to bring a sweater because a storm is moving in. I learned how to be alone without being lonely, or at least that is what I told myself while the afternoon light thinned and the news hummed in the background. I keep routines because routines carry a person across the hours. Mornings belong to coffee and the small patio that looks out over my yard. The birds argue over the feeder, and I make mental notes about the fence that needs repainting. On Wednesdays, I walk with Judith to the cafe off Greenwood, where they over-toast the bagels and the server knows to bring extra lemon with my water, even though my knees prefer the booth, because it is easier to slide in. We talk about gas prices, about another storm battering the coast, about whatever the commentators cannot agree on that week. Judith is the kind of friend who will turn down the volume to listen to the cicadas and say that the noise inside our heads is louder anyway. I nod because I know she is right. When Ethan married Tara, I set a spare key on a blue dish by the back door and told myself families share spaces. Ethan is my only child, a steady man who builds overpasses and makes lists on yellow pads. His work sends him to Montana for a month and to Arizona for 2. And he swears the travel is temporary, even as the projects keep multiplying. He texts me photos of steel beams against pale winter skies and tells me he misses my roast chicken on Sundays. I tell him he is doing important work, and I mean it. When he is home, the house is louder. He stomps mud from his boots and asks if the thermostat is too low. He looks like his father when he laughs. Tara learned my coffee machine faster than I did. She has the kind of efficiency that draws a line through every box. In public, she is attentive and warm, the daughter people compliment for being so thoughtful. She remembers my birthday and once brought over a salmon fillet with dill that could have come from a cooking show. When Ethan is in the room, she reaches for my plate and asks about my knees. The way she speaks makes the room behave. I try to believe in the picture we look like from the outside. When Ethan travels, the air inside the house changes temperature. Tara still stops by, but the visits feel like inspections. She looks at the mail pile and the basket where I keep my pharmacy receipts. She reminds me about flu season. Her smile holds steady even when her eyes are somewhere else. I tell myself this is what younger people are like, brisk and forward, always moving through rooms with a purpose. A woman who sells homes to the wealthy has habits that make sense for her line of work. I fold the thought until it lies flat and continue with my day. It is a cold fall this year. The morning fog settles low, and I can taste rain in the air by mid-afternoon. The news is a quilt of headlines I keep half an ear on. A woman on television argues about interest rates. A man talks about a wildfire 2 counties over that might send smoke our way. I turn the volume down and listen to the washing machine tumble towels in the basement, a sound that has comforted me since Ethan was a boy and grass stains were a sign of healthy games. The cycle thumps and settles, and I feel calm knowing the house is working. Judith says that calm can also mean neglect. She tells me not to shrink to fit other people's expectations. She laughs and says I should join the community center group that meets on Thursdays to complain about the city council. I tell her my time is perfectly full. She looks at me the way only a friend can when she knows a story I have not let myself read yet. On the walk home, we pass a yard sign that says vote, and I imagine the city asleep under all that polite lawn care. The sky bruises purple, and the air tastes like snow. Afternoons slide into early dark. I cook simple meals that warm the kitchen and leave leftovers for the next day. Salmon with roasted broccoli when the fishmonger says it is good. Chicken thighs with rosemary when I want the house to smell like a sundae from years ago. I wipe the counters twice. I wipe the table even when it is already clean. There is comfort in making surfaces gleam. My hands know each drawer break and the cupboard that sticks. I imagine this knowledge is a kind of ownership no one else can claim. The first time I noticed the new camera by the hallway plant, I assumed Ethan installed it for safety. The lens is the size of a dime and blinks a soft light that fades when I look straight at it. I decided not to feel watched. I decide that a person can choose where to place her attention. I fold laundry in the living room and let an old baseball game play on the muted television because the rhythm of the innings is easy. My knees ache from the weather. The furnace wakes up again. There is a way a house changes when someone believes it belongs to them more than to you. It is subtle, like a picture frame nudged a half-inch to the left, or a stack of paperwork moved from a desk to a kitchen counter. I find my folders placed in a different order. The spare key is not on the blue dish one afternoon, then reappears the next morning as if it had been there all along. I tell myself a breeze could nudge a dish, and a mind could forget a detail. I tell myself that kitchens lose and find things at their own pace. Sleep is not as simple as it once was. I wake at 2 and listen to the house settle. A branch brushes the roof, and in the distance, a train works its way east. I picture the desert after the first snow, how the sage wears a white cap and the road lines vanish at the horizon. I breathe and count. I think of my husband and how he used to say that a person should keep her paperwork clear and her heart soft. I try to do both. By morning, I have a list for the day and a steady voice again. I do not yet understand how quiet can become a hiding place for other people's plans. I still believe that if I keep my routines and my head held straight, the rooms will treat me fairly. I love this house. I love the pine shadows that crawl across the hallway around noon and the way the basement smells like detergent and cold concrete. I believe that love is enough to steady a home. I am not ready to see what is already moving under the surface. It was a Tuesday morning when I decided to pull out the old lockbox from the bottom drawer of my desk. I had been meaning to review my accounts before the end of the year, making sure everything was in order. Years in finance left me with a habit of checking and rechecking figures, even in retirement. The balance sheets were familiar friends, lines of numbers telling the story of decades of careful planning. My house was paid off, the investment portfolio still healthy despite the markets, and the retirement accounts had grown quietly in the background. Altogether, it came to just under $3.8 million. I did not think of it as wealth in the way people talk about yachts or country clubs. For me, it was the net result of a life lived without waste, of long work days and decisions made with the next 20 years in mind. I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread neatly in front of me. marking a few notes about upcoming tax deadlines. The sun was low and pale through the blinds, and the coffee had just cooled enough to sip. That was when Tara came in from the back door, holding a reusable grocery bag in one hand and tapping her phone with the other. She set the bag on the counter and glanced toward the table. I noticed the moment her eyes landed on the statements. It was a flicker, almost nothing, but her gaze lingered just a beat too long before she smiled. She asked about my morning, her voice bright, and began unpacking spinach, apples, and a carton of eggs. I gathered the papers slowly, sliding them back into the folder. Her smile stayed in place, but there was a small tilt to her head as if she were measuring something. The rest of that day carried on like any other, but her visits became more frequent after that. Sometimes she brought over small things for the fridge. Sometimes she came by just to check if I needed help with the garden tools before winter. Each time, her eyes seemed to wander, taking in more than the surface of things. She commented on how organized my desk was, how lucky I was to have such a steady income in retirement, how she wished her own mother had been as disciplined. I told myself she was just making conversation, but the attention felt pointed. Ethan called that evening from a motel in Montana, telling me about the progress on the bridge his crew was working on. I mentioned that Tara had been stopping by more often, and he said it was good she was keeping an eye on me while he was gone. His voice was warm, proud even, and I did not want to cast shadows where he saw light. So I said nothing more and listened as he described the snow piling up outside his window. By the end of the week, Tara had managed to find reasons to be at my house nearly every day. One morning, she arrived with a stack of mail she said had been left at their address by mistake. She set it on the counter, then noticed the small fireproof safe in the corner of the dining room. She asked how old it was and whether I had ever thought of upgrading. I explained that it had served me well for decades and kept important documents safe from both fire and prying eyes. She nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against her hip as though she were thinking of something else entirely. I caught her looking at my bookshelves once. Not at the spines of the novels, but at the decorative boxes that held family photographs and small valuables. She moved closer, running her finger along the edge of one before setting it back exactly as it had been. Her movements were smooth, almost casual, but I felt the air change in the room. I folded the dish towel in my hands and told her there was coffee if she wanted some. She declined, saying she had to meet a client in half an hour, and left without touching the mug I had set out. Judith noticed the change in my tone when I spoke of Tara during our Wednesday walk. She asked if everything was all right at home, and I told her I was simply adjusting to the different rhythm of things when Ethan was away. Judith gave me the kind of look that suggests she was not convinced, but she let the subject drop and steered the conversation toward the latest city council debate over zoning laws. I was grateful for the shift, though the thought of Tara's watchful eyes stayed with me through the afternoon. That weekend, Tara offered to help me sort through some old files in the upstairs study. She moved quickly, setting aside envelopes and leafing through folders with practiced efficiency. When she came across the folder that held my updated will, she paused, reading the label before placing it back in the drawer without comment. I felt a cold thread run along my spine, though I smiled and thanked her for her help. She left soon after, saying she needed to prepare dinner for a potential buyer she was courting. I watched from the window as she walked to her car, her posture straight, her pace unhurried. The numbers from that Tuesday morning stayed in my mind. 3.8 million was not a number I thought about often, but now it seemed to follow me around the house. I wondered if Tara had said anything to Ethan about what she saw. I wondered if her increased visits were simply a coincidence, or if something had shifted the moment she noticed the truth of my accounts. I kept these questions to myself, telling no one, not even Judith. Instead, I locked the folder in the safe that evening checking the tumblers twice before closing the door. The click was firm and final, but it did not quiet the unease that had begun to grow. It was late in the afternoon when the call came from Ethan. His voice was tired but light, telling me the job in Montana might run a week longer than planned. He said Tara would be around more, making sure I had everything I needed. I told him that would be fine, and hung up just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the yard. An hour later, Tara showed up in her work jacket, her hair still pinned neatly from whatever meeting she had attended. She carried a folder in one hand and a flashlight in the other. She stepped inside with the kind of urgency that suggested something needed immediate attention. She explained that the insurance company had called about a policy she had arranged for the house, and they needed an old document to finalize it. She said she was sure it was down in the basement, somewhere in the storage boxes near the furnace. I hesitated. The basement was chilly this time of year, and my knees had not been kind to me that week. But she was already walking toward the door at the end of the hall, turning on the flashlight as she went. I followed, telling myself it was better to have these things in order. She opened the basement door and held it for me, the beam from the flashlight cutting a narrow path down the wooden steps. The air grew cooler as I descended, carrying the faint scent of detergent and concrete. I could hear the hum of the freezer in the corner. Tara stayed at the top, saying she would hand me the folder when I found the right box. I moved toward the shelves against the far wall, running my fingers over the cardboard edges. The labels were faded, some written in my late husband's careful block letters. I called up that I was not seeing anything marked for insurance, but there was no reply. I turned toward the stairs and heard the slow creak of the door above me. The sound was followed by a distinct metallic click. It was not the casual push of a door drifting shut. It was deliberate. I stepped to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The light from the hallway was gone, replaced by the thin beam of the flashlight lying on the step, its cone aimed uselessly at the wall. I called her name, my voice steady at first, then sharper. Still nothing. My eyes adjusted to the dim light from the narrow basement window high on the wall. Dust floated in the thin strip of gray. I climbed a step, testing the doorknob, and felt the resistance. It did not turn. I tried again, harder, the wood of the frame groaning slightly under the pressure. The knob stayed firm. The stillness in the basement became heavier. I stood there, my hand on the cold metal, listening for movement above. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard gave a small pop, then silence again. I could feel my heartbeat in my palms. I went back down the stairs, scanning the shelves for anything that might serve as leverage. A wooden broom handle leaned in the corner, worn smooth where my hands had gripped it over the years. I picked it up and tapped the ceiling under the kitchen, sharp enough to make a noise but not enough to splinter the wood. No answer. Minutes stretched. The cold began to sink into my shoulders, the kind that seeps through sweaters and lingers in the bones. I thought of Ethan, hundreds of miles away, picturing me safe at home. I thought of Judith, her words about not shrinking to fit other people's expectations. My mind began to wander into places I did not want it to go, wondering how long Tara intended to leave me there. I moved toward the far wall again, checking the boxes without really seeing them. The labels swam in and out of focus as I tried to keep my breathing even. A drip somewhere near the foundation plinked into a shallow puddle. My knees ached from standing, so I lowered myself onto an old crate, feeling the wood flex beneath me. Above me, faint but clear, came the sound of footsteps moving across the kitchen floor. Slow, deliberate, as if she knew I was listening. Then the sound faded toward the front of the house. I closed my eyes for a moment, willing my mind to stay calm. There was nothing to be gained from panic. I would wait. I would listen. The daylight through the basement window dimmed further until the only light was the weak glow from the flashlight on the stairs. I picked it up, aiming it along the edges of the shelves, the corners of the room. The beam caught the curve of a rusted toolbox, the faded green of a garden hose coiled neatly, the dull sheen of old paint cans stacked too high. Everything in its place, as it had been for years, except for me. It was only then, sitting there in the cool dim, that I began to understand this was not about an old insurance policy. This was something else. Something that had begun the moment she saw those figures on my financial statements. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, letting the thought settle until it was no longer a question but a fact. The house above me was quiet again, as if holding its breath. The air in the basement had settled into a heavy stillness, the kind that makes every sound sharper. My hands were stiff from holding the flashlight too long. I set it down on the crate beside me and tried to stretch my fingers, flexing them to keep the blood moving. My knees protested when I stood, but I knew sitting in one spot would only make it worse. I began walking slowly along the shelves, brushing my fingertips across the dusty edges, scanning for anything useful. The floor above me gave a sudden groan, followed by the faint thump of footsteps. They were unhurried, deliberate. I froze, tilting my head to listen. There was a brief pause, then the unmistakable sound of music coming from upstairs. It was loud enough to fill the house, a bouncy tune that seemed out of place in the dim chill below. It struck me then that she was making it impossible for anyone to hear if I called out. I climbed the first few steps to test the doorknob again. The cold metal felt rough under my palm. I twisted, jiggled, pushed, but the door stayed locked. I knocked, not hard enough to splinter the wood, but firm enough that the sound should have carried. The music upstairs only seemed to grow louder. Turning back, I misjudged the distance to the next step and my foot slipped. My body lurched sideways and I went down hard, my shoulder clipping the wall before I landed on my hip. The pain shot straight through me, sharp and immediate, followed by a dull ache that made it hard to breathe for a moment. I stayed there on the steps, eyes closed, counting until the worst of it passed. The skin on my palm was scraped raw where it had caught the edge of the step. When I finally pulled myself upright, I leaned against the wall until my legs steadied. My left knee throbbed in time with my pulse, reminding me that the cold and the fall were going to make moving around harder. I took slow steps back to the concrete floor, my breath clouding faintly in the flashlight's beam. I had spent a lifetime avoiding drama, keeping my life neat and controlled, and yet here I was, locked in my own basement, injured, with the person responsible somewhere above me pretending nothing was wrong. I forced myself to look around again. The shelves were crammed with the same odds and ends I had stored for years. Holiday decorations, old board games, boxes of photographs. But I saw them differently now. Every object became a potential tool, a way to make noise or pry something loose. I picked up an old curtain rod and tested its weight in my hands. Too thin to break the door, but maybe strong enough to wedge into the frame if I had to. The minutes blurred together. I tried knocking again at intervals, hoping to catch her attention, but the music never faltered. At one point, I thought I heard the front door open and close, footsteps on the porch, but if she left, she locked me in without a second thought. The cold was settling deeper into my bones. I moved to the far side of the basement, where an old blanket hung over a stack of boxes. It smelled faintly of cedar and dust, but it was enough to drape over my shoulders. I paced slowly to keep my muscles from stiffening, each step echoing off the bare walls. The scrape on my palm stung every time I flexed my fingers. At some point, I heard the creak of the stairs leading up from the kitchen, then the muffled thud of the basement door being checked. My breath caught, thinking she might open it, but the sound was followed only by the twist of the lock and the fading of footsteps again. She knew I was still down here. She had no intention of letting me out. That realization landed heavier than the fall. The polite smile, the careful tone she used when Ethan was home, the small, seemingly harmless intrusions into my routines. It all looked different now. She had planned this moment with enough confidence to act while my son was hundreds of miles away. I sat back on the crate, pulling the blanket tighter around me, and stared at the thin line of light filtering in through the small basement window. Dust floated lazily in the beam. Outside, the sky was turning the flat gray of early evening. Time was moving, whether I wanted it to or not. My knee ached, my shoulder throbbed, and the chill was beginning to creep into my chest. I thought about what it would take to make it through the night down here, how I could conserve my strength, what I might need to do when the opportunity to leave finally came. Above me, the music played on, cheerful and steady, like nothing at all was wrong. I had begun to lose track of the hours when I heard the shift of weight on the floor above me. The music cut off mid-song, leaving the air so still that even the hum of the freezer felt louder. My body tensed, every muscle ready for whatever came next. A moment later, there was the faint sound of a voice. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but then I realized it was upstairs, muffled through the wood and insulation. Tara was speaking into the phone, her tone low but brisk. I could only catch pieces of it, but the words that did reach me landed hard. She spoke about documents, transferring accounts, making sure signatures were in order. Her voice sharpened briefly as she said she would have everything in place before Ethan got back. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, straining to hear more, my ear nearly pressed against the door. Then she said something that made the cold in my bones feel sharper. She mentioned that I would not be a problem much longer. The words were followed by a pause, as if she was listening to a response. And then she added that I was too stubborn for my own good. There was a rustle of paper and the creak of her chair. The rest of the conversation was swallowed by the walls. The angle from the basement gave me a narrow view through the slim gap under the door. I could see a sliver of the hallway, the shadow of her legs as she walked past. A small blinking light caught my eye near the top of the doorway. I stepped back and realized it was the reflection from one of the new security cameras she had installed. The realization sat heavy in my chest. Those cameras weren't just to watch the front porch or the driveway. They gave her eyes in places I had once considered private. I retreated down the steps, keeping to the far wall where I thought the camera might not catch me if it could see through the crack. My mind kept replaying her tone when she spoke about me not being a problem. It wasn't the way someone talks about a person they care for. It was the way someone talks about an obstacle. The basement felt smaller with that knowledge. I tried pacing, but the ache in my knee from the fall earlier slowed me. The scrape on my palm throbbed each time I flexed my fingers. I picked up the old broom handle again, running my thumb along the smooth wood, thinking about whether I could wedge it into the lock or use it to pry at the hinges. But the basement door opened inward toward her side, and the frame was solid oak. It would take more than a broom handle to force it. I turned my attention to the shelves again, moving slower this time, scanning for anything that didn't belong. That was when I noticed a newer box wedged between two old ones. The cardboard was clean, no dust settled on top, and the handwriting on the label wasn't mine. I leaned closer, reading the neat black marker. It said miscellaneous tools, but the weight of it when I pulled it forward told a different story. I set it on the floor and lifted the flaps just enough to peek inside. Inside were several small electronic devices, each wrapped in bubble wrap, and a few stacks of paper held together with rubber bands. I didn't dare take them all out in the open where the camera might catch me, but I slipped one bundle of papers under my sweater and pushed the box back into place. The sound of her footsteps returning across the floor above made me freeze. I tucked myself into the shadow between the shelves, my heart pounding. She moved past the basement door without stopping. Then I heard the front door open and close. The stillness that followed told me she had left, though I didn't know for how long. I pulled the bundle from under my sweater and used the flashlight to scan the top page. It was a printed email exchange between Tara and a name I didn't recognize, discussing the sale of a property at a price far below market value. There were notes about forged signatures, and at the bottom, a list of account numbers. I turned a few more pages and found a letterhead from a local bank, along with a signed withdrawal slip for a sum large enough to make my hands shake. I knew enough from my years in finance to understand exactly what I was holding. This was fraud, deliberate and substantial. And if she had hidden it here, in my basement, it meant she felt safe keeping it under my roof. The thought made my stomach twist. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made me shove the papers back under my sweater and slide into the narrow gap behind the water heater. I stayed there until I heard her voice in the kitchen again, this time humming faintly as if nothing in the world was amiss. Every detail of the afternoon settled in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet have the full picture for. But I knew one thing with certainty. Tara wasn't just after my money. She was capable of things that could ruin lives, and she was confident enough to leave the evidence within arm's reach of the woman she had locked away. The papers I had hidden under my sweater inched their way into my thoughts until I could no longer focus on the cold or the ache in my knee. I had seen forged signatures before, back when I was still working, but never with my own family tied so closely to the person behind them. I knew this wasn't some harmless shortcut or a bending of rules to speed along a sale. It was calculated theft, and it had been happening long enough for her to feel untouchable. I slid the bundle back into the shadow under the crate where I was sitting, tucking it behind a layer of old newspapers so it wouldn't be visible at a glance. If Tara had placed that box on the shelf without telling Ethan, then it meant she believed no one would ever find it. That thought carried the same weight as the locked door above me. It was a confidence built on control. She had me contained, the evidence hidden, and the time to make whatever arrangements she needed before Ethan came back. My eyes drifted toward the far end of the basement, where the light from the small window fell in a narrow strip across the floor. I had avoided that corner earlier because of the dampness, but now I noticed something I had not before. The baseboard there had a section where the paint looked fresher, as if it had been replaced recently. Curiosity pushed me toward it. The wood was slightly uneven, and when I pressed my fingers along the edge, one piece shifted under the pressure. I knelt, ignoring the protest in my knee, and eased it outward. The smell of stale air rushed up, followed by a faint clink of metal. Inside was a small tin box, the kind meant for cash or receipts, with a tarnished latch. It was heavier than it looked. I carried it back to the crate and set it in my lap. The latch came open easily, and when I lifted the lid, the beam of my flashlight fell on stacks of photographs bound with a rubber band, a few folded documents, and something metallic at the bottom. The photographs were old but well kept. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Pictures of houses, some of them mid-renovation, others staged for sale. But as I looked closer, I recognized one of the properties from a news segment a few years back. A wealthy retiree had died in what was called a freak accident on the construction site of his new home. I remembered the brief coverage, the way it disappeared from headlines almost as soon as it appeared. In one of the photographs, Tara stood in the background, clipboard in hand, smiling at something out of frame. Beneath the photographs was a folded letter from a law firm in another state, its contents blurred from moisture but still legible enough to see the words settlement and undisclosed amount. I read it twice, feeling my stomach tighten. There was no question in my mind that the death and the settlement were linked, and that Tara had benefited from it in ways no one had investigated. Finally, I reached the metallic object at the bottom of the tin. It was a key, old-fashioned in style, heavier than the ones I used for the house. I turned it over in my hand, tracing the notches with my thumb. Whatever it opened, it was important enough for her to hide alongside evidence that could ruin her. A sound from upstairs broke my focus. The creak of the hallway floor, then the faint scrape of a chair being pushed in. I quickly closed the tin, slid it under the blanket draped over the boxes, and returned to my seat. The footsteps moved toward the front of the house, then faded. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the edges of everything shifting in my mind. The locked door was no longer just a barrier keeping me in place. It was the line between what I knew before and what I could no longer ignore. Tara wasn't just planning to take my assets. She had already crossed lines that put her in a different category entirely. The key weighed in my pocket like a secret. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I knew that finding it was more than luck. It was a turning point. My body still ached. My knees still throbbed. But a different kind of strength began to take root under the pain. If she had hidden so much down here, then there was more to find. And I had the time to look. The light from the small window was nearly gone now, leaving the basement in a muted gray. I pulled the blanket tighter, not just for warmth, but to cover the outline of the key against my leg. The hours ahead would be long, but they would not be wasted. Somewhere in this house, there was a lock that key belonged to, and whatever it opened might be exactly what I needed to turn the situation around. The photographs from the tin box had not left my mind since I first saw them. Even now, tucked back under the blanket, their images stayed sharp in my memory. I could see the unfinished siding of that house, the ladder leaning at an angle, and Tara in the background, clipboard in hand. I remembered the man who had owned that property. He was in his 70s, newly retired, with plans to build his dream home overlooking the river. His death had been reported as an accident, a fall that snapped his neck instantly. It was the kind of story that disappears quickly, especially when no one is asking questions. The settlement letter in the box made the photographs heavier in my mind. It was proof that money had changed hands, but it did not say how or why. I had worked in finance long enough to know that settlements rarely happen without someone pushing to keep a matter quiet. Combined with the forged documents in the other bundle I had found, the picture forming was not of a single lapse in judgment. This was a pattern. That knowledge changed the temperature in the room. It was no longer just about my savings or my house. Tara was not simply opportunistic. She was capable of moving past moral boundaries without hesitation. If she had been involved in that man's death, even indirectly, then there was no line she would not cross to protect herself. I stood in the dim basement light, listening for movement upstairs, every sound now carrying more weight. The occasional creak of the house settling could just as easily have been her shadow moving from room to room. I tried to picture the next steps in her mind. She might think locking me down here was enough, but people who operate in shadows tend to plan for every outcome. The key in my pocket seemed to pulse with meaning. It belonged to something she valued enough to keep hidden alongside her most incriminating possessions. Finding that lock might be the only way to uncover the full scope of what she had done. But moving around the house to search would mean getting past her, and that was a risk I could not take without knowing where she was or how closely she was watching. The chill from the concrete floor was working its way into my back again. I shifted on the crate, pulling the blanket closer. I thought about Ethan, about how deeply he trusted her, and how impossible it would sound if I told him what I had found. He would want proof solid enough to outweigh every lie she might feed him. That meant holding on to what I had, guarding it until the moment I could place it in the right hands. A faint noise pulled my attention upward. It was the front door opening, then closing with a decisive thud. I waited for the sound of her car engine, and when it came, it faded down the road until the silence felt almost wide enough to breathe in. She was gone, at least for now. I moved quickly to the window, peering out at the stretch of driveway and the dark outline of the fence. No sign of her car. My hands itched to search more thoroughly, but I knew the locked door above me would take time to breach without tools. The broom handle, the old curtain rod, none of it was enough. I would have to wait for a chance when the door was open, even if only for seconds. The daylight outside was fading toward evening. The small strip of sky visible through the window turned from pale blue to the muted gray of approaching night. I sat back down, the key still warm from my grip, and let the truth settle in a little deeper. I was not just a target for theft. I was the one person who had seen enough to end her, and that made me something far more dangerous in her eyes. When the sound of her car had faded completely, I let a few minutes pass, counting the steady beat of my pulse just to be certain the house was empty. The quiet above was different now, stretched thin and unbroken, without the creak of footsteps or the hum of music meant to drown me out. My hands moved without hesitation, gathering the tin box and the bundle of papers I had hidden earlier. If this was the only opening I would get, I could not waste it. I climbed the stairs slowly, the ache in my knee sharp with each step, and pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. I tried the knob, half expecting it to resist. But this time it turned. The faint click of the latch releasing was almost louder than I wanted it to be. I opened the door a few inches and listened again. Still nothing. The hallway light was off, leaving only the dim evening glow from the living room windows. I stepped out, careful to avoid the spots on the floor that tended to groan under weight. Every sound felt amplified, as if the walls themselves were listening. The air upstairs was warmer, carrying the faint scent of whatever candle she had been burning earlier. I moved toward the kitchen first, thinking of the back door. My fingers brushed the cool metal of the deadbolt, and for a moment, I thought of slipping out into the dark and running straight to Judith's house. But another thought stopped me. If I left with nothing but my own words, it would be her version against mine. The evidence I had was enough to raise suspicion, but if there was more, this was my only chance to find it. I turned toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The master bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and inside, the blinds were drawn. I crossed to the closet, pushing aside the neat row of dresses and jackets, until my hand found a small locked case on the floor. The key in my pocket slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for this moment. The latch opened with a crisp snap. Inside were more documents, neatly filed, each with tabs marking property sales, loan agreements, and transfers. Many of the names on the papers were unfamiliar, but the signatures, some genuine and some poorly imitated, told their own story. There were also 2 passports, one hers, and another with a different name, but her photograph. The sight of it made the air feel heavier, as if I had just opened a door to a part of her life no one was supposed to see. I closed the case, locked it again, and slid it back into place. My hands shook as I backed out of the room, the weight of what I had just seen pressing hard in my chest. The temptation to take something was strong, but the risk of her noticing even a single missing page could ruin everything. I already had more than I could explain away if I were caught. In the living room, I paused to listen one last time. The stillness outside matched the stillness in the house. I went to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit my face, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wet leaves. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and crossed the yard, moving quickly, but keeping low near the fence line. Judith's porch light was on. I reached her door and knocked twice in quick succession, the way we always did for each other when it was urgent. When she opened it, the look on her face shifted from surprise to concern in seconds. She stepped aside to let me in, and I crossed her threshold feeling the tension in my spine begin to loosen, if only a little. The basement was behind me now, but the weight of what I carried, on paper and in my mind, was something I knew I could not set down just yet. Judith closed the door behind me and locked it without needing to be asked. The warmth of her living room wrapped around me, carrying the faint scent of tea and wood polish. She didn't speak right away, only guided me toward the sofa where a folded quilt waited. I sank into the cushions, still clutching the tin box and the bundle of papers. My fingers felt stiff, the cold from outside refusing to leave. When I told her what had happened, I kept my voice steady. I explained how Tara had led me into the basement, locked the door, and left me there. I described the documents I had found, the photographs, the forged papers, the passports. Judith listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly as each detail settled in. She had known something was wrong for a while, but the scope of it made her lean back in her chair as if to take in the full weight of the story. When I finished, she stood and went to her writing desk in the corner. From the top drawer, she pulled out a small address book and a phone that looked older than it was. She flipped through the worn pages until she found a name and number, then turned back to me. It belonged to Lawrence Kane, a lawyer she and I had both known for years. He had once been a client of mine when I was still working, and I remembered him as someone who valued precision and patience over theatrics. If anyone could help build a case solid enough to stand against Tara, it was him. Judith placed the call, keeping her voice low. Within minutes, she had arranged for him to come over that evening. While we waited, she brought me a mug of hot tea and a plate with crackers and cheese. My stomach was too tight to eat much, but the warmth of the tea helped thaw the tension in my hands. The minutes stretched, each sound from outside making me tense. But no car slowed in front of the house until Lawrence's old sedan finally pulled into the driveway. He stepped inside with his coat collar turned up against the cold, carrying a leather briefcase that had clearly seen years of use. After greeting us both, he sat across from me and asked me to walk him through everything from the beginning. I told the story again, this time focusing on the chain of events and the evidence I had brought. When I placed the documents on the coffee table, his expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. He examined each page carefully, nodding at certain points and making quiet notes in a small pad he carried. When he reached the photographs and the settlement letter, he paused, tapping the paper lightly with his pen. He said this could be enough to open inquiries in multiple directions, especially with the forged financial documents to connect the patterns. But he also warned me that confronting Tara directly before law enforcement was involved could give her time to destroy the rest of the evidence. We began to map out a plan. Lawrence would take copies of the most critical documents that night, securing them in his office safely. Judith would keep the originals hidden in a place only she and I knew about. In the meantime, I was not to return to my house unless it was to set the stage for catching Tara in her own words. The idea was simple but dangerous. I would have to act as if nothing had happened, returning to her space, giving her the sense that she still held control. All the while, we would arrange for law enforcement to be ready to step in the moment she incriminated herself. Lawrence would contact an investigator he trusted, someone who could operate quietly until the time was right. By the time we finished, the clock in Judith's hallway had chimed 9. The night outside had deepened, the kind that pressed against windows and made every porch light seem smaller. I felt the fatigue in my bones, but beneath it was a thread of resolve. I had been pushed into the basement thinking I was powerless, but now I knew better. Tara's certainty had left her careless, and that carelessness was the opening we would use. When Lawrence left, the documents were safely divided, the plan in motion. I stayed at Judith's that night, lying on her guest bed with the quilt pulled up to my chin, listening to the house settle around me. My body ached, but my mind held to one thought. The next time I stepped into my home, it would not be as someone cornered. It would be as someone ready to end this. 2 days later, Lawrence called to say the investigator was ready. His name was Peter Hale, a retired police detective who had a reputation for working quietly and getting results. That morning, I returned to my house with Judith following in her car at a distance. The air was brittle with frost, and each step toward the front door felt heavier than it should have. Tara had no idea I had spent the night at Judith's, let alone that I had spoken to a lawyer and laid the groundwork for her undoing. When I walked inside, she was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy at the sink. Her voice was light, almost too light, as she asked about my walk. I gave her short answers, letting her believe I was still subdued. In truth, I was focused on the placement of the small recording devices Peter had given me the night before. One would be hidden in the living room lamp, another tucked behind the jar of utensils on the counter, and the last in the corner of the basement where she had kept me locked. That afternoon, Peter arrived, posing as an old friend who wanted to check the furnace for me. Tara barely looked at him, waving her approval as she scrolled on her phone. He moved through the house with a calm, deliberate pace, planting the last of the devices and checking the angles for the small camera Lawrence had authorized for the hallway. By the time he left, the net was in place. The first piece of bait came that evening. I left a bank statement, printed from an old account, on the kitchen table where she would see it. It showed a modest withdrawal, but it was enough to stir her suspicion. Her eyes lingered on it as she passed, and I could almost hear the wheels turning. She thought I might be moving money without her knowledge. She didn't mention it right away, but the change in her voice told me she was beginning to push for control again. 2 nights later, she made her move. I was in the living room, pretending to read, when she came in holding the statement. Her tone was sharp, layered with the authority she thought she had over me. She told me it was dangerous for someone my age to handle finances, that she should take over for my own safety. I kept my voice calm, agreeing in part, but not handing her the information she wanted. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but Peter's equipment caught every word. The real break came the next morning. Tara entered the basement, unaware that I was standing just behind the doorframe at the top of the stairs. She was on the phone, her voice low but clear, talking about getting the rest of my accounts transferred. She mentioned a notary, hinted at documents she would have me sign while I was tired. She even laughed about how quickly things would be done once I was settled somewhere. The weight of those words was heavy, but they were exactly what we needed. That recording, paired with the forged documents and photographs, formed the foundation of Lawrence's case. Peter came by that evening to collect the files and transfer the audio to secure storage. The plan now was simple in theory, but required precision. We would let Tara set up her own trap, and when she tried to have me sign anything, law enforcement would be waiting nearby. For the first time in weeks, I felt the balance shifting. She still thought she was in control, but every step she took was tightening the loop around her own plans. As I sat in my bedroom that night, the house unusually quiet, I realized the fear had lessened. It wasn't gone, but it no longer owned me. What replaced it was something colder, steadier. I was ready for her to make her final mistake. The next morning carried the stillness of a stage before the curtain rose. Lawrence had arranged everything. 2 officers in plain clothes waited in an unmarked car down the block. Peter was stationed nearby with a clear line of sight to my front door. Judith had taken her car to the corner store, ready to return the moment she received my signal. The plan was to let Tara believe she had me where she wanted. All I had to do was keep my voice steady and my hands from trembling. She came down from her room mid-morning, her hair perfectly arranged, wearing the smile she used when she thought she was in control. In her hand was a neat folder, thin but deliberate. She set it on the table with a casualness that did not fool me. Her words were syrupy as she talked about a small matter that needed my signature, something to simplify my affairs. She poured me tea before sliding the papers across. I glanced at the top page without lingering. It was exactly what Lawrence predicted, a transfer of authority disguised as a harmless update. Her eyes watched my every move, searching for hesitation. I asked for my glasses, pretending to struggle with the fine print, buying time. My fingers brushed the edge of the table twice, the signal Peter had told me to give. I could almost feel the air shift outside. Tara leaned in, pointing to the line she wanted signed, speaking in that coaxing tone that masked her urgency. Her knee bounced slightly under the table. I kept my expression mild, as if unsure but compliant. Just as I picked up the pen, there was a sharp knock at the door. It was firm, professional, the kind of knock that expects an answer. Her head snapped toward the sound, but before she could rise, the officer stepped inside with the calm authority of people who knew exactly why they were there. They addressed her by name, their voices steady as they explained she needed to come with them. The color drained from her face, and she stammered about a misunderstanding, glancing at me as if I might rescue her. I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap. The folder was still on the table, untouched except for the faint mark of my fingers on its edge. One officer retrieved it, sliding it into a clear evidence bag. Peter entered then, a quiet shadow who had suddenly stepped into the light. His eyes met mine for a moment, and I felt a rush of something that was not quite relief but close. Tara's protests grew sharper as the officers guided her toward the door. She accused, deflected, tried to turn the story around, but the weight of the recordings and documents made her words sound hollow. The last thing I saw before the door closed was the tight set of her jaw, a look that carried both fury and the dawning realization that her game was over. The house was silent again, though the air still seemed to hum from the tension. Peter stayed behind for a few minutes, confirming the evidence was secure and that Lawrence would call me shortly. When he left, I sat in the kitchen alone, the steam from the tea long gone cold. I expected to feel triumphant, but instead there was a strange emptiness. The threat was gone, yet the shadows she had cast still lingered in the corners of my mind. I poured the tea down the sink, rinsed the cup, and stood at the window, watching the last trace of the unmarked car disappear at the end of the street. It was over, at least the part everyone could see. 2 weeks after Tara was taken away, the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Sunlight came through the windows without being swallowed by tension. The furniture was still where it had always been, the walls unchanged, yet the air felt lighter. Lawrence had called to say the case was moving quickly, that the evidence Peter had gathered was airtight. There would be a trial, and I would be called to testify. But my nights were no longer broken by the sound of her footsteps upstairs. I spent my mornings walking through the garden, tending the plants that had been neglected. My hands in the soil felt like proof I was still here, still capable of claiming what was mine. Sometimes the quiet would stretch too far, and I would catch myself listening for the faint scrape of her heels in the hallway. Old habits are slow to die, but each day I reminded myself that the locks on the doors were mine now, and they opened from the inside. Peter came by one afternoon with a small envelope. Inside was the key I had found in the basement, the one that had set everything in motion. He said I should keep it, as a reminder of the moment I chose not to be silent anymore. I held it in my palm for a long time before setting it on the windowsill where the sun could catch it. Word traveled quickly in the neighborhood. Some people looked at me with sympathy, others with curiosity, but no one dared ask for the details they could only guess at. I realized I no longer cared about whispers. My truth was mine, and I had lived it. That was enough. On the day I finally opened the old storage trunk in the attic, I found photographs of my younger self with Robert. Moments from a time before the shadows of greed touched our family. I placed them on the mantle, not as a longing for the past, but as a statement that I had survived it. As the days turned into weeks, I began writing down the story in my own words, not to relive it, but to set it down and make room for what would come next. Freedom does not arrive with fanfare. It comes in the slow unfolding of mornings without fear, in the quiet knowledge that you kept your dignity when someone tried to take it. I am not the woman I was before all of this, and I do not wish to be. I am stronger now, sharper, and I know that my silence will never again be mistaken for weakness. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.